Today, let's talk about linear scoring of dairy cattle, or linear evaluation. Linear evaluation is a system for describing what cows look like, describing individual conformation traits. We apply scores to multiple traits, and the scores range from 1 to 50. And again, the purpose is just to describe the biological extremes, to describe what the cow looks like. This process doesn't tell us whether traits are good or bad. It's just to describe what they look like. And many of these traits can be objectively measured, that is, quantified, literally pull out a measuring stick and measure them. The purpose of linear evaluation is to collect information on dairy cows around the world for 3 reasons. First, as I've said, is to describe what the individual cows look like. The second is to bring together data on daughters of all the bulls that are available, and collating their data, we can know what daughters of a specific bull look like. This is very useful for producers in deciding what bulls to use. And the third, and in many ways the most important purpose, is to evaluate what characteristics profitable cows exhibit. That is, cows that make a lot of milk and live a long time, what do they look like? Linear scoring lets us answer that question. There are traits that we score in multiple categories. There are many traits that are body traits, stature and strength, body depth, and so on. There are multiple traits associated with feet and legs. And then, of course, many traits used to collect information on what cows' udders look like. Now let's talk through the traits, starting with the udder traits. As you know, udder depth is the top priority within the top priority category, udders. So we'll start with that trait. But as we talk through this, and as we talk through the remaining traits, pay special attention to 2 things. First, which way do the scores go? What does a high score represent, and what does a low score represent? In some cases, this is intuitive, but in other cases, for instance, udder depth, it's not necessarily intuitive, so do pay close attention to that. Second, pay attention to which are one-way traits, so in other words, kind of a low to high, where the the high value of 50 would be considered ideal, versus which traits are what we call two-way traits, where the intermediate is ideal and the cow can vary in either direction from that ideal. So we'll start with udder depth, and it's scored with a high score, means an udder held high above the hocks, a very youthful udder. A low score is a lower udder, a deeper udder, a more pendulous udder. So we'll start with that low score. If the floor of the cow's udder is 2 inches below her hocks, that puts her in that 1 to 5 point range. Moving up, if the floor of a cow's udder is even with her hocks, that's a 15. If it's 2 inches above the hocks, that's the intermediate. That's what is preferred in this trait, and that's a 25 point. And then moving up to the high end, a cow's udder held 6 inches above the hock would score a 45. This is a measurable trait. So again, when professional classifiers are starting out, they're actually measuring this to kind of calibrate their eye. Rear udder height is the next trait that we'll talk about, and again, it is a measurable trait, and again, it's rated on a scale of 1 to 50. 1 is an extremely low rear udder attachment, and 50 is extremely high. This is a trait where the high score is most desirable, and it's also a trait that is measurable. So we measure from the base of the vulva to the top of the rear udder. An optimal measurement, the highest score, a 50-point rear udder height, measures 7 inches below the vulva. On the other end of the extreme, a rear udder attachment 13.3 inches below the vulva receives a 5. And the intermediate, the score of 25, is a rear udder that's 10.5 inches from the base of the vulva to the top of the rear udder. So literally a measurable trait, and one where the high score is the ideal. Rear udder width is similar. It is a trait where the high score is the ideal. It is also a trait that is measurable. So a very narrow rear udder scores between 1 and 5 points. A very wide rear udder scores between 45 and 50 points. And it's measured horizontally across the top of the secretory tissue where the udder attaches to the body wall. A score of 45, a very high score, a very wide rear udder attachment, is a rear udder that is 7.5 inches wide at that point. If it's a score of 25, we've got a rear udder that's 5.5 inches wide, a rear udder attachment 5.5 inches wide. And the narrow, a score of 5, is a width of 3.5 inches wide. Let's move on to udder cleft, also very important to dairy cows, and similar to the two that we've looked at before. The high score represents an extremely strong cleft, which is desirable. A very low score is a very weak cleft, of course, undesirable. And like the two rear udder teats, this is a measurable score, a measurable trait. Really, really strong cleft with a measurement of 2.5 inches from the udder floor between the rear teats to the top of the crease. So if there's 2.5 inches there, that's a score of 45. An intermediate would be 1.25 inches from the top of the crease to the base of the udder, the base of the udder at the base of the rear teats, and that's 1.5 inches. And on the other end of the spectrum, if there's no crease at all, the score is 5, moving down to 1 if as indicated in the picture above. The next udder trait that we'll talk about is the placement of the front teats. This is a primary trait, and it's a trait where the high score means the teats are extremely close on the extreme inside of the quarter. A low score is very wide placement on the outside of the quarter. And one thing to note is that this trait and the suspensory ligament trait sometimes go together, but not always. And the picture here with a low-scoring wide teat placement is a good example. A cow can have a strong cleft and wide teat placement. So we score these traits independent of each other. In this trait, the ideal is the median score, the 25. We want the front teats to be placed centrally on the quarter. Now let's talk about fore-udder attachment. Fore-udder attachment is a primary trait. It's scored from 1 to 50. This is a trait where 50 is the optimal. And this is not a measurable trait. This isn't something that we can pull out a measuring stick and score. An average fore-udder attachment receives a linear score of about 25. And then a really outstanding attachment, very tight, very snug, will score a 40 or higher. On the other hand, a fore-udder attachment that's really loose, then it scores down in that 1 to 5 range. This is a trait. Scoring this trait takes a little bit of experience since it's not a measurable trait. Now, teat length is a two-way trait. So the optimal is the intermediate. Teat length is a measurable trait in that there is a specific measurement associated with specific scores. So long teats score 45 to 50 points, and they are 3.25 inches or longer. Very short teats are 1.25 inches or smaller. In a production setting, in a commercial setting, in all settings, we prefer the intermediate size teats. Ideal teat length for Holsteins is 2.25 inches. As we wrap up our discussion of udder traits, let's revisit the purposes for this data. On the bottom of this screen is the sort of breakdown one can have for a cow. This happens to be from a Jersey cow, so the abbreviations are slightly different, but the principle holds. We can look at these data and see this cow, even if she lives on the other side of the world, even if she's long dead. And with this data, we can do those three things, right? Describe the cow. We can lump her data together with data from thousands of other cows, and we can compare them, and we can see if the daughters of bull number 1 are different than daughters of bull number 2. By pooling this data, we can see, for instance, maybe bull number 1's daughters on average are an inch taller than bull number 2's daughter. That's useful information. It helps breeders choose the bulls that they want to use, and as you can imagine, it's also important for marketing of those sires. Also, we can attach this data to data from this same cow, her milk production, and her longevity. This is really valuable. If we can pull together this kind of data, both descriptive type traits, production, and longevity data from thousands and thousands of cows, we can really discover what traits are predictive of profitability. What do high-producing, long-lived, profitable cows look like? We can ask questions like, does stature influence milk production? By comparing stature scores and milk production data from thousands and tens of thousands of cows. We can ask the question, does udder depth influence longevity? This is really powerful information. It helps us go beyond sort of impressions or gut instincts or feeling, and this is the basis of a great deal of genetic progress that's been made in the last 20 or 30 years. So now that we've remembered what these traits are used for, let's go back and talk through some more. Dairy form is a primary trait, and it focuses on openness of rib. And a tricky thing when assessing dairy form is that it needs to be scored independent of stage of lactation. What we're looking for are cows that appear angular and open, and those will score 50. An extremely tight-ribbed cow will score at the low end of the range. So this is a trait, it's not a measurable trait, and it's a trait where 50 points is optimal. Next, let's talk about body depth. This is a trait that measures the circumference of the barrel, and it's fairly intuitive. Higher scores represent extreme depth. Lower scores represent a more shallow frame. This is a measurement made at the front end, and it's, again, pretty straightforward. Next, let's talk about strength. This scores the width of the chest floor. It is a trait where 50 is the extreme strong and wide, and so perceived as positive, and cows that are extremely narrow and frail are perceived as negative. Moving on from those traits, let's now talk about scoring feet and legs. And feet and legs are complicated. There are several places that we look, several traits that we are interested in, and so we score these traits separately. Let's talk first about rear leg side view. This is one where, again, you got to pay attention to which way the scores go. An extremely sickled hock is a high score. A very straight hock is a low score. I remember this because a straight-legged cow, her leg looks like the number 1. And that's a mnemonic that works for me. The straight-legged cow, the posty-legged cow scores 1 because that's literally what her leg looks like. This is a trait where the intermediate is desirable. Another trait to look at is rear legs, rear view. We just get behind the cow and look at her, and what we want is for her to track straight ahead. Not towing out, not hocking in. So it's scored 1 to 50. 50 is the desirable end of the range. We want them to track straight forward. And a cow that hocks in or tows out severely scores down in the 1 to 5 range. A third very useful and very important trait that we score for feet and legs is foot angle. Again, this is a trait that it's a little tricky to remember which way the numbers go. A score of 50 is an extremely steep angle, and a score of 1 to 5 is an extremely low angle. I remember this by correlating it with height of my heels. So a very high score would be as if the cow is standing on a high heels. She's very upright, very steep. A very low score is as if the cow is wearing flats, a very low angle. Now let's talk about 3 traits that are within the frame category: stature, and then the width and the angle of the rump. All 3 of these are traits that can actually be measured. Stature is fairly intuitive. High scores equal taller cows. A Holstein that is 59 inches or taller will score between 45 and 50 points. For jerseys, that would be a 53-inch tall jersey scores in that 45 to 50 point range. Then the width and the angle of the rump width is fairly intuitive. Higher scores equal a wider rumped cow. And oftentimes we're asked, where do you measure the width of the rump? For linear scoring, it is between the pin bones, inside of the pin bones. And extremely wide, 7 inches, is a 50 point. Extremely narrow, just 2 inches between those pin bones, would be between a 1 and a 5. The angle of the rump is a trait that is A, measurable, and B, where the intermediate is the preferred. So, and it's also a trait you've got to pay close attention and find a way to remember which way the scale goes. For rump angle, a high score equals extremely sloped from hooks to pins. I remember this by focusing on the letter H. High score, high hooks. High score, high hips. Hips above the pins. On the other end of the spectrum, pins clearly higher than the hooks would be between a 1 and a 5. Here's the important thing to know. The mid-range here, this 25 points, that's not a perfectly level rump. That's not what we're looking for. A 25-point rump angle has the pins just about 1.5 inches below the hips. So this is the top of the pins, about 1.5 inches below the top of the hips. So we've talked through all of the traits, and there's one more step in the classification process we should talk about. When the classifier finishes scoring the cow, finishes this linear scoring process, another process starts. And in this process, he or she considers the traits that he or she's just scored within the 5 categories of the Holstein scorecard. Obviously, for other breeds, they're not using the Holstein scorecard. They use the PDCA scorecard with 4 categories. So a Holstein classifier, in this case, kind of steps back and combines the traits that are within each category. And the categories are udder, dairy strength, front end and capacity, feet and legs, and rump. And you can see on this slide the proportion of points associated with each and the priorities within each. Classifier basically puts a 50 to 97 score on each of these categories, and the weighted average of those becomes the final score of the cow. So a cow's final score is based on the 5 major classification categories, the breakdowns, and the classifier numerically assigns breakdown a score. The breakdowns actually are scored between 1 and 100, but you'll see that the range of scores, really, of final scores, is between a 50 and a 97. Only 29 Holstein cows, at least at this point, have earned a 97-point score. So that's the highest score ever been assigned. Only 29 cows ever have. The first cow to score 97 points was Lyndon Dictator Wimble Wimpy. She was almost 13 years old in 1963 when she received that 97-point score. Obviously, that was a big deal. Since then, very few cows have earned the score. One of the recent ones, the most recent one, is Harvey Roy Frosty, scored at 97 points. Kind of interesting to look at the contrast between those 2 cows, and you kind of get a sense of how the Holstein breed has evolved in the last 40 years. So this final score, cows that are scored between 90 and 97 are called excellent. Cows 85 to 89 are very good, good plus, good, fair, and poor. And the average final score in the Holstein breed is somewhere around 77 points. Now I want to back up and revisit the category of stature, because this has been a really interesting conversation in the last 5 or 10 years. Commercial dairymen have always known that overly tall cows don't fit their facilities really well and aren't the most functional. And stature is highly heritable. So as we've been giving credit to animals or favoring tall cows, over time all of the breeds of cows have gotten quite a lot taller. And we definitely are at a point now that some of the biggest Holstein cows just don't fit in functional commercial facilities. In 2011, the Holstein Association actually came out with a policy to discourage or at least not favor overly tall cows. So you can see John Connor was the Holstein USA Director of Type Evaluation at the time, and just kind of acknowledging the problem. And so they put it in a policy that's enforced on the final score of the cow. If cows are taller than 59 inches, there is actually a deduction in their final score. So once they're up over 59 inches, they can be deducted up to 2 points from that front end and capacity category on the Holstein scorecard. The maximum deduction of 2 points would be for cows that are 62 inches and above. This equates to a deduction of 0.4 points from a cow's final score. One thing to note, standard policy, if a cow is less than 2 years old when she is scored, her stature score is age adjusted. Now, in practice, very few cows will actually lose points on their final score, because you can see the maximum that a final score would be moved down is 0.4 points. But this represents an important statement by the Holstein Association about the value of stature in their breed. Thinking again about these traits, I just want to review one thing, and that is the 6 traits where the mid-range is probably what we consider the ideal. And these are rump angle, the side view score on rear legs, foot angle, we want that intermediate, not too steep, not too shallow, the placement of the front teats, the length of the teats, and now stature. Periodically, the breed associations decide to begin collecting data on additional traits that are perceived as being important to production, longevity, profitability. Here are some examples right now. The Holstein Association, for instance, is collecting data on locomotion. And so what they're looking at is abduction. So are the cows towing out with a short stride and kind of walking like they're skating? That would score in the low end of the range. If they've got a medium stride and slightly towed out, that would score in the mid-range. If they have a very long stride and stride straight, that's a high end. And the reason we're collecting data on this is we honestly don't know how these cows should be walking. So what we're going to do is collect this data for a while, also associate that data, collect data from those same cows on how much milk they give and on their longevity, and then we can determine if this trait is associated with production and longevity and profitability, and if it is associated, what's the desirable trait? This is kind of the great example of why linear scoring is useful. We can start with an objective measurement, and we can let the cows tell us which end of the range is desirable. We're doing the same thing with rear teat length, rear teat placement, and body condition score. Basically, right now, we don't have enough information to know just how important the length of the rear teats is. We don't have enough information to know just how important the placement of the rear teats is. And the same with body condition scoring. And so by collecting data on these research traits, collecting the associated production and longevity records from these cows, we can let the cows tell us what they should look like. So again, just to review, the comparison between linear scoring and dairy judging. Linear scoring, the purpose is just to describe the individual traits, scoring them from 1 to 50 at the extremes. We're just describing. Many of these traits can be objectively measured. Then we correlate these data with production and longevity and profitability records, and we let the cows tell us what they should look like. Judging is a more complex exercise. It starts with this observation process. It starts with us observing the depth of the udder and the strength of the cleft and the sets the cow's hock. But then when you're judging, you've got to integrate information from all of these traits. You have to decide on a ranking of the cows, and then you have to defend your placing of the cows. So these two approaches, these two systems are very different and for different purposes. And with that, we will wrap up our discussion of linear scoring.